Man, I counted at least 15 black people on that montage. Hey!
What if I told you that one man has spent decades doing what nobody else in Hollywood dares to do? Looking the most powerful, most protected, most untouchable people on the planet directly in the eyes, and destroying them. Not behind closed doors. Not in a private group chat. Not in a carefully worded tweet designed to go viral without consequences. No, right there. In front of millions. On live television. With nowhere to run, nowhere to hide, and no publicist in the world fast enough to do damage control before the wound was already bleeding. That man is Chris Rock. And what he has done throughout his career is not just comedy. It is something far more dangerous. It is the truth, wrapped in a punchline, delivered with a smile sharp enough to cut through steel. But here is what most people never talk about. The moments that made even the celebrities in the room go quiet. The jokes that crossed lines nobody thought could be crossed. The targets that fought back. The nights that ended careers, ignited feuds, and changed the entertainment industry forever. Because behind every legendary roast, behind every brutal punchline, there is a story the cameras almost missed. A story about power. About ego. About what happens when fame meets fearlessness. Tonight, we are pulling back the curtain on all of it. And trust me when I say, the last revelation in this video will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about the most talked about moments in Hollywood history. So before we dive in, if you are new here, hit that subscribe button right now. And here's why that actually matters. Every single subscription tells the YouTube algorithm that this content is worth spreading. It is how we grow, it is how we reach more people, and it is how we keep bringing you the stories that mainstream media refuses to touch. Hit the like button too. It costs you nothing, but it means everything for this channel. And if you want to go even further and support what we are building here, drop a super thanks. Every contribution keeps this channel alive and independent. And if that is not possible right now, no worries at all. Just drop a comment telling us what surprised you the most. We read every single one. Now sit back, do not touch that skip button, and get ready, because what comes next is going to hit different. To understand why Chris Rock does what nobody else in Hollywood dares to do, you have to go back to the beginning. Not the beginning of his fame. Not the beginning of his Netflix specials or his sold-out world tours that filled arenas in cities across 6 continents. Not the beginning of the red carpets, the magazine covers, the late-night appearances, or the moment his name became synonymous with a kind of comedic fearlessness that the entertainment industry had never quite seen before and has not quite seen since. You have to go back much further than any of that. You have to go back to Andrews, South Carolina, in the early 1970s, where a boy named Christopher Julius Rock III was born into a working-class family with very little money, very little influence, and absolutely zero connections to any world that resembled the one he would eventually come to dominate. His father, Julius Rock, drove a truck and delivered newspapers. His mother, Rosalie, worked as a teacher's aide and in a center for people with disabilities. They were not wealthy people. They were not connected people. But they were, by every account that has ever been given by anyone who knew them, people of enormous integrity, people who believed that you said what you meant, that you did what you said, and that the truth, however uncomfortable, was always preferable to the comfortable lie. That household is the first place Chris Rock ever learned that lesson. And it is a lesson he has never forgotten, no matter how many millions of dollars, how many industry relationships, or how many standing ovations have come and gone since then. But the real crucible, the experience that forged the specific, razor-sharp, uncompromising voice that would eventually make him one of the most influential comedians in American history, was not his home. It was school. Because Julius and Rosalie Rock made a decision that many parents in their community considered brave, and that many others considered complicated, they enrolled their son in a school outside their neighborhood, in a predominantly white area of Brooklyn, as part of a voluntary busing program designed to promote integration. And every single day, young Chris Rock got on a bus and traveled to a world that had not been built with him in mind, and that made absolutely certain he knew it. The bullying was not occasional. It was not the kind of low-grade social friction that most children experience at some point and eventually work through. It was relentless. It was physical. It was the kind of sustained, organized cruelty that leaves marks that no amount of success or fame or therapy ever fully erases. It just teaches you how to carry them differently. He was beaten. He was taunted. He was made to feel, every single day, in 100 different ways, both overt and subtle, that he did not belong in that space and that the space would do whatever it needed to do to remind him of that fact. And the teachers, the adults who were supposed to protect him, supposed to intervene, supposed to be the last line of defense between a child and the worst impulses of other children, largely looked away. Because looking away was easier. Because looking away required no courage, no confrontation, no willingness to upset a social order that most of them had decided was simply the way things were. Chris Rock eventually dropped out. No diploma. No safety net. No plan B. Just a teenager with a ferocious intelligence, an almost photographic memory for human behavior, and a burning, urgent need to make sense of a world that had spent years trying to convince him he was worth less than he was. He started washing dishes. He worked fast food. He did whatever he had to do to survive in New York City as a young man with nothing but his mind and his hunger. And then, at 18 years old, he walked into a comedy club. And everything changed. Not immediately. Not in the cinematic way that movies would later teach audiences to expect from origin stories: the single performance, the standing ovation, the talent scout in the back of the room who changes everything in one magical night. It was slow. It was grinding. It was night after night of performing for small rooms, sometimes nearly empty rooms, absorbing feedback that was sometimes generous and sometimes devastating, learning the architecture of a joke the way a carpenter learns the grain of wood through repetition, through failure, through the slow accumulation of knowledge that cannot be taught in any classroom. He watched comedians who were better than him and studied why. He watched comedians who were worse than him and studied why. He developed an almost scientific approach to the construction of a punchline, not just what the joke said, but how it moved, where it breathed, what it asked the audience to do with the truth it was delivering. And then Eddie Murphy saw him perform. Eddie Murphy, at that moment arguably the most powerful comedian on the planet, a man who had already redefined what black comedy could look like on the biggest stages in the world, walked into a small club, watched this young, hungry, brutally honest kid from South Carolina work a room, and recognized something. Something specific. Something rare. The thing that separates the people who are talented from the people who are genuinely dangerous. He took Chris Rock under his wing. Introduced him to people. Opened doors. Gave him access to rooms and conversations and opportunities that would have taken years to reach otherwise. And perhaps most importantly, he gave him something that no club booker or industry executive ever could: the unambiguous message that the biggest stages in the world were not just theoretically possible. They were coming. And it was Chris Rock's job to be ready for them when they arrived. His time at Saturday Night Live, which began in 1990, is remembered by most people as a stepping stone, a launchpad. But Chris Rock himself has been remarkably candid about how difficult and how disillusioning that period actually was. He felt invisible on that show. He felt like his voice, the specific, unfiltered, deeply personal voice he had spent years developing in clubs, was being sanded down, smoothed over, made palatable for an audience and an institution that had a very specific idea of what comedy was supposed to look and sound like. He was not given the space to be fully himself. And for a comedian whose entire power comes from the specificity of his perspective, being denied that space was not just frustrating, it was suffocating. When he left SNL, the industry's verdict was quiet but clear. Nice try, not quite there. He went back to the road. Back to the clubs. Back to the grinding, unglamorous, absolutely essential work of developing material in front of real audiences who had paid real money and who would tell you, with devastating immediacy and zero ambiguity, whether what you were doing was working or not. And it was in those rooms, not on a television set, not in a writer's room, not in any institution designed to produce acceptable entertainment, that Chris finally, fully, completely became Chris Rock.
You know who's got the hardest job tonight? Javier Bardem and his wife are both.
Let us talk about the moment that stopped the world. The moment that generated more headlines, more think pieces, more furious arguments at dinner tables and in comment sections and in group chats than almost any other single event in the history of modern celebrity culture. March 27, 2022. The 94th Academy Awards. One of the most watched live broadcasts on the planet. Billions of eyes tuned in from every corner of the world, watching the entertainment industry celebrate itself with a particular kind of self-congratulatory grandeur that only Hollywood can produce, with a straight face, the designer gowns, the curated speeches, the carefully managed emotion, the sense that what was happening in that room on that night was not just the distribution of golden statues, but the ratification of cultural significance itself. And then, in the middle of all of that, in the middle of all that manufactured elegance and carefully controlled spectacle, something happened that no publicist, no producer, no network executive, and no crisis communications team anywhere on Earth could have scripted, predicted, or contained. Will Smith walked onto that stage and slapped Chris Rock across the face. On live television. In front of the entire world. With no warning, no build-up, and no possibility of a second take. But here is what you need to understand before anything else. Here is the thing that the 30-second clips and the viral reaction videos and the breathless breaking news coverage almost universally failed to communicate. The slap was not the most shocking thing that happened that night. Not even close. The most shocking thing, the thing that, if you sit with it long enough, reveals something deeply troubling about the institution that was sitting in that room watching, was what happened in the hours that followed. But we will get to that. First, let us examine what actually happened, because the version of events that most people carry around in their heads is missing several layers of context that change the picture significantly. Chris Rock was hosting that segment of the show. He made a joke about Jada Pinkett Smith's shaved head, comparing her to the 1997 film G.I. Jane, a film whose central image is a woman shaving her head in order to prove herself worthy of a military environment that was designed to exclude her. It was, on one level, a simple visual gag. Shaved head equals G.I. Jane. Quick, clean, easy to read. But Jada Pinkett Smith has alopecia, an autoimmune condition that causes unpredictable and often significant hair loss, and one that she had spoken about publicly, with considerable openness and evident vulnerability, in the months and years leading up to that night. The question of whether Chris Rock knew about the diagnosis at the time of the joke has been debated extensively. His own subsequent statements suggested that he did not, that the joke was aimed at the aesthetic and not the condition. But whether he knew or not does not fully resolve the moral question, because intent and impact are not the same thing, and the entertainment industry has spent considerable energy in recent years insisting that that distinction matters. What is not in dispute is what happened next. Will Smith, sitting in the front row with his wife, initially appeared to laugh at the joke. Then, apparently registering Jada Pinkett Smith's reaction, he stood up, walked onto the stage, and struck Chris Rock open-handed across the face with enough force to be heard through the microphone. He then returned to his seat and, while Chris Rock was still processing what had just happened, shouted twice, with a ferocity that the network's audio delay only partially managed to suppress, a demand that Rock keep his wife's name out of his mouth. And then, and this is the part that no clip fully captures, Chris Rock kept going. He collected himself with a speed and a composure that, when you go back and watch it, seems almost physically impossible given what had just occurred. He made a brief, controlled acknowledgement of what had happened. He moved on, he finished his segment, and he left the stage with his professionalism not just intact but somehow enhanced by the contrast with what had just been done to him. In the immediate aftermath, the internet split in predictable ways. There were people who argued that Will Smith's response was understandable, that a man defending his wife from a cruel joke about a medical condition was acting out of love and loyalty. There were people who argued that nothing, no joke, no provocation, no hurt feeling justifies physically assaulting someone on live television. There were people who argued that Chris Rock should not have made the joke in the first place, regardless of what he knew about the diagnosis. And there were people who argued that the real story was not the slap at all, but the response of the institution to the slap specifically, the decision by the Academy to allow Will Smith to remain in the room, collect his award, and receive a standing ovation from an audience that included virtually every major power player in Hollywood. That last group was onto something. Because what the standing ovation communicated, what it said, not with words, but with the specific, unmistakable language of who gets applauded in which rooms, was that in Hollywood, certain kinds of power are simply more protected than others. Chris Rock had spent years making those people uncomfortable. Years of pointing at their hypocrisy, their pretensions, their carefully maintained images, and finding the gap between the public performance and the private reality. Years of doing exactly what a healthy culture desperately needs artists to do, holding a mirror up to power and refusing to look away when power looks back. And when a member of that power structure walked up and hit him, the room stood up and clapped for the man who threw the punch. Think about what that moment revealed. Not about Will Smith. Not about Chris Rock. About the room. About the institution. About the specific, unspoken hierarchy that governs who is protected and who is expendable in the most powerful entertainment ecosystem in the world. And then consider this in the weeks and months that followed, as the conversation about the slap continued to dominate the cultural discourse. The voices that emerged most loudly in defense of Will Smith were almost never engaging with the actual ethics of what had happened. They were engaging with the narrative, with the image, with a carefully constructed public persona of a man who had spent 3 decades being almost universally beloved and who had, in one unguarded, unscripted, genuinely human moment of loss of control, done something that the narrative was simply not built to accommodate. Chris Rock, meanwhile, said nothing publicly for months. He toured. He performed. He processed. And when he finally spoke, when he finally addressed it directly, on his own terms, in his own voice, without a publicist or a statement or a carefully managed press moment, what he said was not what anyone had been expecting.
Man, I counted at least 15 black people on that montage. Hey!
Will Smith is not the first powerful person in Hollywood to push back against Chris Rock. He is not the second, and he is probably not the fifth. Because when you build a career on saying out loud the things that powerful people have paid enormous sums of money and invested enormous amounts of social capital to keep unsaid, those powerful people eventually push back. And the specific way they push back, the tools they choose, the alliances they activate, the narratives they try to construct, tells you almost as much about the structure of Hollywood power as anything Chris Rock has ever said about it from a stage. Let us start with the 2016 Oscars, which in many ways represents the most complete and most revealing example of what Chris Rock does when he is given an institution rather than an individual to work with. The context was this. For the second consecutive year, not a single actor of color had been nominated in any of the 4 major acting categories. The hashtag #OscarsSoWhite had turned from a social media observation into a full cultural reckoning, with prominent black actors, directors, and filmmakers publicly boycotting the ceremony. The Academy was under more pressure than it had faced in decades. And into that pressure cooker, they invited Chris Rock, a black comedian who had never in his career demonstrated any interest in softening a truth for the comfort of the people who needed to hear it, to host the show. It is unclear whether they understood what they were actually asking for. What they got was one of the most sustained and methodical public dismantlings of an institution by one of its invited guests in the history of live television. Chris Rock did not limit himself to a few pointed jokes in the opening monologue and then retreat to safer material for the rest of the evening. He returned to the subject again and again, from different angles, with different levels of intensity, calibrating each moment with the precision of a comedian who has spent 30 years learning exactly how hard to push and exactly when to push harder. He named specific decades during which black performers had been excluded. He noted, with an acidity that the audience's nervous laughter could not quite neutralize, that the reason black people had not boycotted the Oscars in the 1960s was not because things were better, it was because they had more urgent things to protest, like being denied the right to vote. He pointed at people in the audience. He made them feel seen, not in the warm, affirming way that the word seen is usually deployed in Hollywood, but in the specific, uncomfortable way that means you have been identified, categorized, and held accountable in front of witnesses. Some people in that room laughed because they were smart enough to know that laughing was better than not laughing, and because some of what he said was genuinely, undeniably funny even when it was devastating. Some smiled the tight, controlled smile of people who have been caught in a truth they cannot publicly deny. And some, through back channels, through conversations with colleagues, through the kind of quiet industry communication that never gets recorded and never gets attributed, made clear in the days and weeks that followed that Chris Rock had gone too far. Gone too far. It is one of the most revealing phrases in Hollywood's vocabulary, and it almost always means the same thing. Not that someone has said something false, not that someone has caused genuine harm, but that someone has said something true in a room where the truth was inconvenient, in front of an audience large enough to matter, in a way that made it impossible to dismiss or ignore. Chris Rock had done precisely that. And the industry's response was precisely what it always is when someone makes the powerful uncomfortable, a gradual, collective, never quite explicit tightening of access, a quiet recalibration of who gets invited to what, a subtle but unmistakable message that the price of a seat at the table is a certain discretion about what you notice while you are sitting at it. Beyond the institutional pushback, there have been individual confrontations, some public, some private, some documented and some rumored, that illuminate the specific social cost of being the person who says what everyone else is thinking. His complicated history with various corners of the entertainment world is peppered with moments where fellow artists, collaborators, and peers have registered their displeasure with the direction of his material. Some of these confrontations have been about the content itself, the specific things he said about specific people. Some have been about the principle, the question of whether any comedian, regardless of how gifted, has the right to cause a certain kind of public pain for the sake of a laugh. And some have been about something more difficult to articulate, a discomfort with the fact that Chris Rock, unlike most comedians who generate controversy, does not seem to experience the controversy as a cost. He does not visibly suffer for it. He does not perform the kind of chastened, reflective public contrition that the culture has decided is the appropriate response to having caused offense. He acknowledges when he believes he has been wrong. He has walked back specific bits that he concluded were harmful in ways he had not intended. But the posture, the fundamental, architectural posture of a person who believes that the truth is worth more than the comfort of the people being asked to sit with it, that has never changed. And for many of the people who have found themselves on the receiving end of that posture, that consistency is itself the most infuriating thing. Because you can negotiate with someone who is performing a position. You can find the pressure points, apply the right kind of social or professional leverage, offer the right kind of alternative, and most people, most of the time, will find a way to the middle. Chris Rock does not find his way to the middle. Not because he is incapable of compromise or nuance. Anyone who has watched his work closely knows that both are present in abundance. But because the middle, on the specific question of whether to tell the truth about powerful people and powerful institutions, has never been a place he was willing to inhabit.
It's like a civil war going on with black people, and there's two sides. It's black people.
There are moments in Chris Rock's recorded career that, if you go back and watch them today with fresh eyes, will make you genuinely, physically uncomfortable. Not because the material is lazy. Not because it is cheap or shock-driven or desperately reaching for attention in the way that lesser comedians sometimes do when they mistake provocation for insight. But because it is so precise, so unsparing, so completely unwilling to offer the audience the escape hatch of ambiguity that sitting with it feels less like watching entertainment and more like being deposed. Like someone has put you under oath and is asking you to confirm things you have spent years arranging your life to avoid confirming. And those moments have consequences. They have generated boycotts and open letters and industry whisper campaigns and the specific, quiet, never quite organized but absolutely coordinated form of social punishment that Hollywood reserves for people who make the powerful uncomfortable without having the decency to apologize for it afterward. Let us begin with Bring the Pain. Released in 1996, it is consistently ranked among the greatest stand-up specials ever recorded, not just in comedy, not just in black comedy, but in the full history of the art form. It won 2 Emmy Awards. It changed the trajectory of Chris Rock's career from promising to generational. And it contained a bit, a specific, extended, brutally constructed bit about divisions within the black community that caused a cultural firestorm that burned for years, that has been written about in academic papers and cultural criticism and personal essays, and that Chris Rock himself has since addressed with a candor that is itself remarkable. The bit made a distinction, sharp, deliberately provocative, designed to force an audience to confront something rather than comfort them through it, between two groups within the black community, using language that was raw and specific and deliberately uncomfortable. It was the kind of material that, in the hands of a less gifted comedian, would have been simply offensive. In the hands of Chris Rock, it was something more complex and more dangerous. It was recognizable. People laughed because they recognized the truth underneath the provocation. And then, sometimes in the same breath, they felt something else, the discomfort of having laughed at something that could be weaponized, that could be taken out of context, that could be used by people who were not going to engage with its complexity or its intention. That concern was not paranoid. The bit was used, quoted, excerpted, stripped of its context and its nuance, by people who had no interest in what Chris Rock was actually saying and every interest in having a black comedian provide cover for their own uglier positions. When Chris Rock eventually walked back the framing of that material, he did not do it in the way that most public figures walk things back, with a carefully worded, legally reviewed statement that admits nothing specific and commits to nothing consequential. He talked about it directly, in interviews and in conversations with other artists, and said something that required genuine intellectual honesty. That a joke can be true and still be wrong in the way it is delivered, because the delivery is part of the truth. That acknowledgement, that willingness to be publicly, specifically wrong about something, is itself a form of courage that most people in his position never demonstrate. But Bring the Pain was not the only time he approached and sometimes crossed a line that could have cost him everything. His material on relationships, particularly on the specific, often painful, deeply human mechanics of romantic failure, has generated enormous controversy throughout his career, from audiences who felt targeted, from critics who felt he was reinforcing harmful dynamics, and from fellow artists who felt that the laughs he was generating came at a price that certain people in the audience were being asked to pay without being consulted. His joke construction around gender, around marriage, around the specific frustrations and failures and compromises of long-term romantic partnership, has always operated in territory where the line between "this is funny because it is true" and "this is harmful because it is reductive" is thin and contested and never quite where you expect it to be. What makes those moments complicated, and what has always made them complicated, is that the material is not simple enough to dismiss. If it were simple, if it were just lazy provocation dressed up as insight, it would be easy to set aside and move on. The problem is that there is genuine craft in it, genuine observation, genuine truth. And the truth is doing something complicated in those moments, because it is both illuminating something real and potentially reinforcing something harmful, simultaneously, in front of an audience that is not a monolith and that is experiencing both of those things at the same time. Then there is the question of his divorce from Malik Compton Rock, which became one of the most painful and most public chapters of his personal life, and which he handled in the way he handles almost everything, by talking about it, on stage, in front of audiences, with a combination of brutality and vulnerability that left people uncertain whether they were watching a comedian process his grief or a grief-stricken man using comedy as armor. The answer, of course, is both. It is always both. Because the line between the two, between processing and performing, between honesty and performance of honesty, is one of the central questions of his entire career, and also one of the things that makes him impossible to look away from. He did not retreat into dignity when his marriage ended. He did not issue a tasteful statement and request privacy. He went on stage and he talked about it, about the failure, about the cost, about what it feels like to have the intimate architecture of your life become the subject of public conversation when you are someone whose job involves public conversation. He aimed the same unsparing camera at himself that he aims at everyone else. And in doing so, he did something that is genuinely rare among public figures of his stature. He demonstrated that his willingness to be honest was not selective, was not reserved for targets who could not hit back, was not a performance of bravery designed for maximum sympathy. It was the same in every direction, even the directions that hurt.
Everybody knows. Everybody
Now we arrive at the part of the story that the people who run Hollywood, who control the flow of projects, who decide which voices get amplified and which get quietly managed out of relevance, would genuinely prefer you never spend too much time examining. Because what Chris Rock has been doing in the years since the slap, since the standing ovation, since the moment the most powerful room in entertainment chose the man who hit him over the man who was hit, what he has been doing is something that goes far beyond comedy or entertainment or even the specific question of his own career. It is, if you watch it closely enough and with enough patience, the most sustained and methodical public examination of how Hollywood power actually works that anyone operating from inside the system has attempted in decades. His 2023 Netflix special, Selective Outrage, was the opening statement of that examination. And it was framed, from the beginning, as something different. Netflix, for the first time in its history, broadcast it simultaneously around the world, a live global event that removed the ability to clip, to decontextualize, to take moments out of sequence and reshape their meaning. Everyone watching was watching the same thing at the same time. There was no algorithm-curated version. There was no highlight reel. There was just Chris Rock, a stage, and approximately an hour of material that the internet had been trying to predict for 12 months. What they got was not a victim's narrative. It was not the carefully calibrated, emotionally generous, publicly sympathetic response that the culture had decided the situation required. It was a prosecution. Methodical, precise, and genuinely funny in ways that made the precision even more devastating, because laughter, when it arrives in the middle of something serious, does not diffuse the seriousness. It amplifies it. It makes you feel the truth in your body instead of just in your head. He addressed the slap directly. He addressed Will Smith's public statements in the months leading up to the ceremony. Statements that Rock argued were a form of public performance that served a specific purpose in Smith's own narrative. He addressed Jada Pinkett Smith's public revelations about the state of their marriage, which had been made in the specific, carefully managed context of a media appearance, in a way that the culture had largely decided was off-limits for criticism because it involved personal pain. Chris Rock decided it was not off-limits. And the reaction was immediate and divided in ways that were themselves revealing. People who had been waiting for him to be publicly, visibly broken by what had happened, to perform the appropriate level of damage, to confirm that the violence had left a mark deep enough to satisfy their sense of justice, were confronted instead with someone who was not broken. Who was, if anything, more precise and more controlled than he had been before. That bothered people. It bothered them in a way that they could not quite articulate, because the specific thing that bothered them, the refusal to be visibly diminished, was not something they could criticize without revealing something uncomfortable about why they wanted it. And then there was the substance. The actual content of what he said, beneath the jokes, beneath the specific targets, beneath the personal material. Selective outrage was, at its core, an argument about a specific kind of hypocrisy, the kind that operates selectively, that reserves its outrage for targets that are socially acceptable while extending cover and complexity to targets that are not. It was an argument about who gets to be complicated in public discourse, about which people are granted the dignity of nuance, the right to be understood as full human beings with contradictions and struggles and mitigating circumstances, and which people are expected to be symbols, to carry meaning on behalf of a community or a narrative or a cause, with all the dehumanizing weight that symbolic status carries. That argument is not comfortable. It does not resolve neatly. It does not end with a clear villain and a clear hero and a lesson that everyone can take home and feel good about. It ends with questions, specific, pointed, uncomfortable questions about the machinery of public sympathy and who controls it and what it costs the people who fall outside its protection. Those are questions that Hollywood, as an institution, is not equipped to answer honestly. Because answering them honestly would require an examination of the specific ways in which the institution itself, its hiring practices, its public relations machinery, its award shows and its press junkets and its carefully cultivated relationships with media outlets, participates in the construction of the very narratives it claims to merely reflect. Chris Rock knows that. He has known it for a long time. And the thing that the slap and its aftermath revealed, the standing ovation, the continued protection, the industry's collective decision about who mattered more in that moment, is that he is right about it in ways that the institution cannot publicly acknowledge without implicating itself. So what does it do instead? It waits. It manages. It hopes that the news cycle moves on, that the conversation shifts, that the next outrage arrives quickly enough to give everyone permission to stop thinking about this one. And in the meantime, Chris Rock keeps touring, keeps writing, keeps walking onto stages and finding the joke that is also the truth, and delivering it to audiences who are hungry for someone, anyone, who is willing to say the thing out loud without calculating the cost first. Here is the last revelation. The simplest one. And the most unsettling. The most subversive thing about Chris Rock is not any single joke. Not the slap. Not selective outrage. It is this. He is still here. Think about what it would take for almost anyone else to absorb a public act of violence, watch the room stand up and applaud the person who committed it, and simply return to work. Same voice. Same targets. Same unbreakable commitment to saying what is true. That is not resilience in the motivational poster sense. That is the stubbornness of someone who decided, early enough that it became character, that honesty was the only option available to him. In a system designed to produce comfortable lies, he has spent his entire career producing uncomfortable truths. And the system has never quite known what to do with him, because you cannot cancel someone who was never trying to be liked. That is Chris Rock. That has always been Chris Rock. If this video gave you something to think about, do 3 things right now. Subscribe. Every subscription tells the algorithm this content deserves a wider audience. Hit like. 1 second. Costs nothing. Changes everything. Drop a comment telling us the moment that hit you hardest. We read every single one. We'll see you in the next one. And you're going to want to be here for it.